Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this month's Food for Thought series. Our topic for Food for Thought is open meetings law, and league attorneys are going to present this one today. Our General Counsel, Maria Davis, will be presenting and assisted by Ryan Sendelbach and Nick Zavos, our assistant league attorneys. So thank you so much, Maria, Ryan, and Nick, for agreeing to share with us some really great information. As always, this is recorded. We'll have it up for members to review later. And the slides are available on the Food for Thought webpage if you want to review those. So with that, Maria, take it away.
Sorry, I lost my mute button for a second there. All right, welcome everybody to the League's webinar on understanding and complying with Wisconsin's open meetings law. Legal topics like this can tend to get a little bit dry and boring, so I'm going to do my best to keep it engaging and open and transparent, just like an open meeting should be. We're going to walk through the key aspects of the law, but we won't be able to address all of its nuances. I will stop a couple times for questions, and we'll have time for questions at the end. However, if we don't get to all the questions, please do feel free to submit your question using our Ask the Attorneys form that you can find on our website. So with that, let's dive into some of the details. Wisconsin has established a really strong legislative policy that favors transparency in government. This is expressed in terms of meetings through the open meetings law that is found in Chapter 19 of the statutes. The policy underlying the open meetings law is based on the premise that the public is entitled to the fullest and most complete information regarding the affairs of government as is compatible with the conduct of governmental business. So that compatibility language there, it's a slight limitation on the openness, but the default is complete openness and transparency for our meetings. The law states that it shall be liberally construed. And what that means is that in their situation where there's doubt or uncertainty, a court is going to err in favor of openness. The law applies to all meetings of governmental bodies, and it has three main requirements. Meetings of governmental bodies need to be preceded by public notice, publicly held in places reasonably accessible to the public, and open to all citizens at all times unless otherwise provided by law. There are some key definitions to be aware of regarding when the open meeting law has been triggered. The first is the definition of a governmental body. It is very broadly defined. It includes your governing bodies, so village boards, common councils. It's also going to include statutory boards and commissions, so boards of review, plan commissions, zoning board of appeals, your police and fire commission. The term includes locally created committees as well, and it's going to include any subunits of any of those foregoing entities. There are some things that don't constitute a governmental body. For example, the term does not include bodies that are formed for the purpose of collective bargaining under certain situations. It's not going to include a government office that's held by a single person. And generally speaking, it's not going to include loosely organized or ad hoc staff meetings. However, there can be some nuance there, but we don't really have time to get into now. But as a general rule, thrown together meeting is not going to be considered a governmental body. Whether an entity is a governmental body depends primarily on how that entity is formed, not the type of authority it possesses. So if a particular entity is created by some action of law, like through an ordinance, a resolution, or a motion, it's likely going to be a governmental body that's subject to the open meetings law, even if its role is just to serve an advisory function or to conduct information gathering, and even if that body is not going to be in existence for very long. Meeting is another critical defined term. It is defined as a convening of members of a governmental body for the purpose of exercising the responsibilities, authority, power, or duties delegated to or vested in that body. There are some exceptions for social or chance gatherings or attendance at a conference. However, those social chance gatherings, conference attendance, that can't be intended to be used to avoid the open meetings law requirements. So for example, If you have a quorum of your governing body that attends the league's annual conference, which, by the way, you definitely should do that. But let's say there's a quorum there. That's not going to be considered a meeting for the purposes of the open meetings law, as long as you're not using that conference as a loophole or a workaround to the law to conduct your business without being open. There is a two-part test to determine if the open meetings law has been triggered. This is known as the showers test. The first prong relates to the purpose of the gathering, and the second prong relates to the number of people gathered. With the purpose prong, if the gathering is for the purpose of engaging in government business, that purpose prong is met. Now, here, government business is not just your formal action on a matter, that time that you take a vote. It also includes discussion and information gathering on matters that are within the body's realm of authority. I also want to point out here that there is a rebuttable presumption. If 1/2 or more of the members of a body are gathered, that gathering, that meeting is going to be presumed to be for a governmental purpose. It is a rebuttable presumption, but the presumption arises regardless. The number prong is met when the number of members gathered is sufficient to determine the body's course of action regarding the topic that's being discussed. So this can be the affirmative power to pass a measure or the negative power to defeat it. So to determine whether you have a sufficient number of members gathered, you first need to understand quorum. In cities, it's going to depend on the size of your common council. So if your council has 5 or fewer members, your quorum is a majority. If the council has 6 or more members, your quorum is 2/3. But the mayor will never be counted for purposes of quorum. In villages, it's always the same. It's just a majority is the quorum, and the president, unlike the mayor, is counted for purposes of quorum. Typically, a majority of a quorum is going to be sufficient for adopting an ordinance or a resolution. And I'm talking about voting requirements because they're important, because they're tied to whether or not you have that sufficient number gathered that triggers the open meetings law requirements. There can also be particular vote requirements, whether they're statutory or local, that require a different number of votes to pass an action. And some statutes require an extraordinary vote. So let's say your board or council is taking up a budget amendment. Well, the statutes say that that's a 2/3 vote that's required. So in these situations, a smaller number gathered can be sufficient to determine the body's course of action. And determining whether you have that requisite number gathered is not always easy. You need to be aware of the possibility for negative quorums and walking quorums as well. A negative quorum is where you have a number gathered that is sufficient to defeat a proposal or to block it. So let's say a simple majority vote of all the members is required to pass a particular motion. If you have 1/2 of the body gathered, it's going to be a negative quorum because 1/2 is enough to block that majority vote, which is 1/2 plus 1. And even if less than 1/2 of the body's members are gathered, it's still possible to have a negative quorum. If you look at the example on the slide, that shows a 7-person body. And let's, assume they're doing a budget amendment. So it's a 2/3 vote requirement. Well, if 3 people gather and talk about that budget amendment, that 3-person gathering is enough to block the 5-person vote that is required to pass the amendment. So the numbers prong of the showers test would be met. You do still have to meet the purpose prong as well, but here you would see that the numbers prong is met because there is a negative quorum. Walking quorums are a little different. Here, a walking quorum is a series of gatherings rather than a single gathering. And it's a series of gatherings among separate groups of members of the body where each group is less than quorum in size, and the groups together agree either, explicitly or implicitly to act uniformly in sufficient number to reach quorum. Now, with walking quorums, that agreement component is a key feature. If you don't have that agreement component present, then it's generally not going to be considered a walking quorum. That's a limiting factor that makes it a little a little more difficult, not impossible, but a little more difficult to have a walking quorum. The Department of Justice has indicated that it can be problematic to keep track of votes or poll votes of a quorum of your body's members, but it's likely okay to keep track of less than a negative quorum's worth of votes. I don't know if that's helpful information, but it's something that they've, weighed in on and said is probably okay. The DOJ also says that governmental body members can sign a document asking for a particular subject to be placed on the agenda, so long as there's not any substantive discussion of that issue or agreement by those signing the document to act in a certain way on that matter. You also, though, can't sign a document that expressly commits those members to a future course of action. Now, the DOJ talks about this in the sense of signing a document, which kind of brings to mind like signing a physical piece of paper. I think mostly this would be done digitally these days. They don't weigh in on that. I think the comparison is pretty analogous, but they haven't spoken to it in that level of detail. The key takeaway here is if you have a negative or a walking quorum and you have not provided public notice or complied with the other requirements of the open meetings law, then you've violated the law. So talking a little bit about the convening aspect, it's a good idea to avoid what we call watering hole meetings. So, you gather at the local bar because we're in Wisconsin or a coffee shop after a meeting. It's not that that's prohibited. I mean, there is still the social or chance exception, and you do have to be conducting government business to meet the showers test. But what you really want to avoid is kind of the appearance. So if a large group or of the council or the village board gathers after a meeting, you don't want it to look like you're actually conducting government business and debriefing what you just talked about at the meeting, even if that's not what you're doing. It's also important to remember that you don't have to be face-to-face to convene. We live in a digital world, and convening electronically is absolutely possible and can trigger the open meetings law requirements. So whether that's email, text, messaging, social media activity can be possible to, accidentally hold a meeting as well. You want to be aware of that. And even with the prevalence of our, digital communications today, the DOJ does still recommend avoiding using electronic communications unless it's simply a one-way communication. I don't think that's really that practical these days to not communicate electronically, but that's where you really want to focus on that advice to make it a one-way communication when you're trying to communicate with the rest of your body. Because problems can arise when you are sending a message to the rest of the body as a whole. You can't control how people respond. So reply all can be a problem. You can have somebody either forget or just not be thinking of it, and they hit reply all, and then everybody else does. And lo and behold, you find yourself in a situation where there's kind of a conversation occurring. One workaround for this is to use a third party. You could have the clerk or another staff member disseminate that information to the rest of the body for you. And what they can do is they can just use blind copy to address the email to everybody else on the body. That way, even if somebody accidentally forgets, they thought they hit reply all, that message is only going back to the original sender, not the body as a whole. When courts look at an electronic conversation, they're going to look at a few different things to see, where it shakes out. Was that a conversation or not, for purposes of the open meetings law? So they're going to look at how many participants were involved, how many communications were exchanged. They're also going to look at the time frame within which those communications were exchanged. And ultimately, what they're going to look at is the extent of which all of that makes this look like a conversation-like interaction. So because you can convene electronically, remote or hybrid meetings must also comply with the open meetings law requirements. The DOJ has for a long time said that telephone conferences are permissible under the law, and they've recently extended that to video conferences as well. And they've also acknowledged that providing remote access to our meetings can actually advance the open meeting law's interest because it gives greater transparency and greater access to government by allowing that remote option. While remote or hybrid meetings are generally allowed, there are times that providing only remote access to a meeting will be insufficient in terms of the accessibility requirement. So, for example, the DOJ has said that if you have a meeting where you're going to be sharing like a complex plan or drawing or chart, or maybe there's going to be some sort of testimony offered where the person's demeanor is going to be significant, then the DOJ talks about in the teleconference setting that it likely would not be considered reasonably accessible to conduct all of that over a telephone conference because important aspects are going to be lost in that exchange and in that delivery to the public. I think Zoom meetings can certainly alleviate some of those concerns, whereas, it's just very different to have that video component compared to an audio only. But the DOJ's compliance guide really just speaks to telephone conferences. So while Zoom can help with that, there are still probably going to be situations where what you're trying to accomplish isn't going to be reasonably accessible over Zoom as well. Ultimately, though, whether a meeting is reasonably accessible is going to depend on the facts of a given situation. And when you're holding a remote meeting, the DOJ strongly recommends providing an alternative dial-in option because you don't want the situation where somebody not having access to internet becomes a barrier to their attending the meeting. There are also some practical considerations to keep in mind when meeting remotely. There are a host of practice pointers out there. I just want to hit on a couple of the important ones. If it's a hybrid meeting where part of the body is meeting in person and other people of the governmental body are attending remotely, then the public attending in person, because it's that hybrid meeting, right? So there's that in-person attendance as well. The public attending in person needs to be given the same access to the remote attendees of the governmental body as the members of the governmental body who are meeting in person. In other words, what that means is you want to avoid a situation where only the body members meeting in person can see those who are attending remotely because, maybe they just have their laptops open to Zoom on the desk in front of them. Instead, the remote meeting platform should be streamed in a way that gives all in-person attendees access to the video and audio. You also want to be careful with closed sessions when you're attending a meeting remotely. Be mindful of your surroundings and whether anyone can hear either end of the conversation that's being conducted. You could wear earbuds and that helps with one end of the conversation, but if you're talking and you're attending the meeting in a busy hotel lobby, that's not really maintaining the confidential nature of a closed session as it should be maintained during a remote session. There can also be implications when governmental body members attend the meeting of another body. So if a quorum of one body attends the meeting of another body to either gather information or otherwise engage in government business within their purview, and if that attendance isn't chance or social, then two meetings are taking place and separate notices are required. The notice for the quorum attending is called a bad key notice, and it stems from the bad key case. In that case, there was a majority of the village board that regularly attended the plan commission meetings to gather information regarding subjects over which the village board had decision-making authority. And that was challenged, and the Supreme Court concluded that because that attendance was regular, it was not by chance, and it really should have been noticed. And part of the idea behind the bad key notice requirement is that if members are getting their information from another meeting, the public should be on notice of that fact so that they have the option to attend the other meeting as well. Because you want to avoid a situation where, maybe that quorum goes to the second meeting, they gather information, and the information presented really answers all their questions. They kind of flesh out all the details there just by listening. And so when they come back to their own meeting, that is the only meeting the public was given notice of, that discussion doesn't take place because all of that information was shared at the meeting the public didn't know about. And so they need to have a chance to go to that meeting as well. With bad key notices, though, they are not going to be required when a quorum of the governmental body is present at another body's meeting simply because they are members of that second body. So here I want to just pause for a minute and take questions if we have some. Are there any questions to go through? I can pull up the Q&A.
There are.
All right, so I see one. So I'm on a city council. The council has forbidden to hit reply all on council emails due to the open meeting law. And is that a correct application of the law? So with this question, it's not that the law doesn't really speak to the reply all, it's whether or not your communications are triggering the open meeting law's requirements because there's a meeting taking place. So I do think the recommendation to not reply all is absolutely proper because that's where you get into the danger zone for, having enough communications where the court could look at it and say, look, you're having a conversation and this is a meeting and it's over email and you didn't make it accessible to the public, you didn't provide advance notice, and that's a violation. So that is generally a good practice tip, is to just avoid hitting reply all. And the reason we say you can kind of bolster that by using the blind copy is that, we're all human, we forget, or you thought you hit reply and you hit reply all, and then that just kind of, sparks a chain reaction and there's an inadvertent violation. So just trying to avoid that is best practice. All right. If a governmental body is attending a commission meeting, or at least a quorum, can the agenda for the commission meeting say that there may be a quorum of the council members in attendance, or do we have to do a separate notice? So this question is really asking, when you have a bad key notice requirement, can you do it in the same notice as your regularly scheduled meeting, or do you have to have two physical separate public notice requirements? And I do believe that we can do separate ones. I cannot remember if the DOJ has weighed in on this or not, or if it's just what the league has said in the past. But I do believe you can do them on the same notice, but you have to make it very clear the distinction between the two meetings. All right, it looks like that is the end of the questions for now, so we can continue on. So moving to notice under the open meetings law, there are three main things to think about: timing, content, and specificity. So with timing, you have to provide at least 24 hours advance notice unless there is good cause and 24 hours notice is impossible or impractical. But you can never, in any situation, provide less than 2 hours notice. Good cause has not been defined, but it's likely akin to an emergency situation. And when you calculate the timing, you count Saturdays, but you do not count Sundays. With content, you need to identify certain things in your notice. So you have to say the identity of the body that's meeting, the date, the time, the location of the meeting. You also want to describe the meeting's subject matter. So what's the reason for the meeting? What are they going to be discussing? And identify any contemplated closed sessions as well. Specificity largely comes into play when you're identifying and describing agenda items, including closed sessions. To be properly noticed, items must be described with enough specificity to be reasonably likely to apprise the public. Reasonably likely to apprise the public boils down to the public's right to the best notice possible at the time that the notice is prepared. The level of specificity required is going to depend on certain factors. So first, what burden, if any, was there for providing more detail in your notice? What is the public's interest in the subject matter? Were they able to anticipate the subject matter? So the more novel or non-routine the item to be discussed is, the greater the burden of specificity you're going to have. Let's say you have, as an example, an item on your agenda called discuss road improvements on Main Street. If that discussion is really just going to be about fixing some potholes, maybe doing some restriping, then that's probably sufficient enough. I don't think there'd be a lot of, significant public interest or controversy there. It's not really a novel issue. But if it's to install two large roundabouts that people are going to have a lot of opinions on, then that's probably not sufficiently specific, and you're going to need to provide some more detail there. You should also avoid using general descriptions like old business or new business. They just don't really let the public know what that means and what's going to be talked about. Sometimes agendas will also contain descriptions like mayor's report or administrator comments. And with these, the Attorney General has cautioned against using vague descriptions like these. There are times that they may pass muster in terms of how much specificity was required, but it's also really likely that they'll fail for lack of specificity. So it's better to include more details here. And frankly, individuals in these positions are often going to have the ability to include more details on the agenda and to give advance notice of what they're going to talk about. So it's best practice to do so. There's a specific procedure for giving public notice. The statutes provide that the presiding officer or their designee communicates the notice to the public and to the media. The most common way of providing notice used to be posting in 3 public places likely to be readily seen. The law was recently changed to allow posting in 1 public place and posting electronically on your municipality's website. I think that is probably, if not already, quickly becoming the more commonplace method, but you still can forego that and post in 3 public places. If you are posting in public places regardless, but especially if you're only posting in the 3 public places, I would recommend considering whether any of those locations offer 24-hour access. There is one other way of providing notice via paid publication. I think that's probably the least common simply because it just costs money and it's a more onerous process. Notice to the media includes your official newspaper if one has been designated, and any media that have filed written requests for such notices. And there can be other statutory notices, other statutory notice requirements as well. And if those come into play, then you need to follow those too. So for example, if it's going to be a zoning amendment that's going to be discussed and there's a public hearing involved, there's a statutory requirement to do a Class 2 notice in advance of that. And so you have to comply with that as well. Your meeting always needs to begin in open session, and meetings have to be reasonably accessible to the public and open to all citizens at all times unless otherwise authorized. Preferably, meetings should be held in a public place. Somewhere like a private dining room or a private club are not going to be considered reasonably accessible. Now, total accessibility isn't required. It has to be reasonable. But reasonable means that if you're expecting high public turnout because there's a large amount of interest in a particular item coming before the body, then you need to plan accordingly. Think about your location and its capacity. Can it handle reasonably all of the people you expect to attend? If not, you may need to relocate. And you might also want to think about adding a remote attendance option to increase that accessibility. And then ADA accessibility is also going to be required as well. Another aspect of accessibility and openness relates to recording an open meeting. Governmental bodies do need to make a reasonable effort to allow those wishing to record a meeting to do so, as long as their recording isn't interfering with the meeting. And while the open meetings law does give citizens the right to attend and observe the meeting, it does not give them an automatic right to participate in the meeting. So you are not required to include a public comment period in your meeting, but the law does give you the option to choose to do so. And if you do, it needs to be included in your public notice. Now, with public comment period, you can impose time limits. You can limit discussion of matters just included on the agenda if you want. But there is a whole host of First Amendment implications here when you're talking about placing parameters on a public comment period. And so before doing so, I encourage you to conduct research, work with your municipal attorney, and make sure that any limitations you put on your public comment period are put in place legally and properly. There's also a common misconception with public comment period that the body members just kind of have to sit there straight faced and be a stone wall. They can't respond to anything citizens say during the time. However, the law actually says otherwise. The law does say that you can discuss matters raised by the public, but you want to do so conservatively. The DOJ has weighed in here as well, and they recommend avoiding any lengthy, substantive discussion of matters that were not included in the public notice. Similarly, you should refrain from taking action on any matter that's raised during public comment period that was not publicly noticed. When it comes to voting, you cannot use secret ballots with one limited exception, and that is when the body is electing its own officers. So if your council is electing the council president, or the Police and Fire Commission is electing its president or secretary, then you can use secret ballots. But in all other situations, there needs to be a record kept of all motions, roll call votes, voice votes, and so on. All right, so I will stop for questions here again. All right, so it looks like there's a question asking to circle back to their previous question, but I'm not sure what that was. But there's a new question. Is Facebook used by any municipalities? Is that considered an appropriate means of notification? There are absolutely municipalities that are using Facebook. For purposes of providing public notice, no, I don't think your Facebook account is going to rise to the level of a valid means of providing that public notice. It's got to be the 3 public places, the municipality's website and 1 public place, or paid publication. And then there's a closed session question, but we're going to get to closed session in just a minute. Does local media need to have notice of every meeting by the council and commission? The default requirement of the open meetings law is that you do have to provide notice to the media. Media can also have special written requests for specific notice of meetings separate from that default. All right, I am going to stop there and then go on to closed session. All right. So as I mentioned at the beginning with the public policy that underlies the open meetings law, it's, open and transparent as compatible with the conduct of governmental business. So there's a limiting factor there. And you see that come with this limited exception to meetings needing to be open that is a closed session. Closed sessions are for serving the public interest, not to offer comfort or convenience for the governmental body. Closed sessions should not be used to avoid controversy. In fact, transparency in controversial matters is at the heart of the open meetings law policy. One area of common confusion with closed session is that they are never required. Rather, you first need to determine what you're going to discuss, look at the statutes to see if you're allowed to go into closed session. And then if you are allowed, it's up to the governing body whether or not they want to choose to go into closed session, but you're never going to be required to. There are 2 types of closed sessions. There's a contemplated closed session and a spontaneous closed session. A contemplated closed session is one planned prior to the meeting. So that needs to be included in your public notice. You know what's going to happen. So you need to, identify the subject matter that's going to be discussed, cite the applicable statutory exemption. And then you're also going to need to provide notice of any intent to reconvene an open session, because the law says that to reconvene an open session following a closed session, you have to give notice to the public of that subsequent open session. And if you don't, you can't reconvene an open session for 12 hours following the closed session. The notice still has to be as specific as possible, even though it's a closed session. Reciting the statutory exemption alone is not going to be sufficient. There are also spontaneous closed sessions, which are kind of like what they sound. They weren't planned in advance and you didn't know they were going to arise. Um, this is permitted under the law. You can hold a spontaneous closed session, but only if the subject matter that you're going to discuss relates to something that was included in your public notice. The governmental body isn't going to be able to reconvene an open session for 12 hours after a spontaneous closed session because there wasn't an advance notice of this spontaneous closed session. So you didn't know that you needed to notice the subsequent open session when you prepared your notice for the meeting. So you're not going to be able to comply with that requirement, meaning you're not going to be able to reconvene an open session for 12 hours. So what we suggest here is just finish all your other business first. You can still hold that spontaneous closed session, but finish all the other business first and then hold that closed session at the end of your meeting. That way you get through your whole agenda, and the 12-hour rule doesn't really come into play that way. There's a certain process that has to be followed when going into closed session. First, the presiding officer has to say that the body wants to go into closed session, and then provide the exemption, the statutory exemption that authorizes that closed session. The motion has to be made and seconded, and then it's going to pass on a majority vote. That vote needs to be recorded unless it's unanimous. And this is actually a good requirement because recording the vote can protect members who voted against going into an unauthorized closed session. It's very, very important to stay on topic, whether you're in a spontaneous or a contemplated closed session, or whether you're in open session, because whether it's open or closed session, the law still requires public notice for every single thing you discuss. If your discussion strays into a topic that wasn't noticed, then that's going to be a violation of the open meetings law. And policing yourself here can be challenging, especially if you've got a great debate going or a really good free-flowing exchange of ideas. But you have to remember you've just got to stick to what's on the agenda because it's easy for conversations to get away from us, especially when we're really engaged in what we're discussing. But the second you stray into territory that's not covered by the public notice, you have violated the open meetings law. There are 11 statutory exemptions that allow closed session to be used in specific situations. I'm not going to cover all of these, but I will focus on those that you'll most commonly encounter. These exemptions are strictly construed. And so if there's a situation and you're trying to figure out, well, does this exemption cover it? Does it not? I'm not sure. If there's doubts about whether or not your closed session is authorized, the best course of action is just to avoid it and stay in open session. Because again, they're going to be strictly construed in favor of openness. The first exemption allows for a closed session when you are deliberating concerning a case that was the subject of a judicial or quasi-judicial trial or hearing before your governmental body. Now here it has to be an actual case. So there has to be some sort of controversy between or among adverse parties. There's got to be some sort of proceeding designed to enforce rights or remedy wrongs. It's not just simple discussions. So it's not going to include a discussion about whether or not we want to grant this permit. But if you're deliberating whether you want to revoke a liquor license, that might be an appropriate use of this exemption. However, one caveat with this exemption is that zoning boards of appeal and boards of review cannot convene under this exemption in closed session, even though it may be a quasi-judicial matter and it might seem at first glance that this exemption applies. The law specifically says that they have to conduct those matters in open session. The second exemption is regarding considering dismissal, demotion, discipline, or licensing of a public employee or person licensed by a board or commission, or investigating charges against such person and taking action on any such matter. So if a closed session under this exemption is going to include an evidentiary hearing or any final action on the matter, then the law requires you to give actual notice of that closed session hearing or final action to the public employee or licensee involved. An evidentiary hearing is more than just discussing again. It involves things like taking testimony and receiving evidence. The actual notice needs to inform the individual of their right to request open session. So if they request open session, that means that the closed session hearing or final action can't be held in closed session. It has to be held in open session. You can still deliberate in closed session, but your hearing or final action is going to have to be taken in open session. The inverse of this is not true. This person cannot demand closed session. They can simply require that you stay in open session. If there's no evidentiary hearing or final action involved when using this exemption, then the actual notice is not going to be required. Next, there is an exemption for considering employment, promotion, compensation, and performance evaluations of public employees over which the governmental body has jurisdiction or exercises responsibility for. The Attorney General's office has interpreted this to extend to public officers like police chiefs, but it does not apply to elected officials. So if you've got a situation where you kind of want to talk about something that one of the members of the governmental body did, and maybe it's, a little sensitive, and you're thinking, oh, maybe we can go into closed session, you can't, because this does not apply to elected officials. This exemption does apply to the hiring process, so you can use it for conducting interviews. It only applies when a specific person is involved, not when discussing a position in general. So let's say that you are looking to hire a public works director, and the city council or the village board wants to determine what salary range it's going to set for that position. You cannot use this exemption for that discussion because it doesn't involve a specific person. You're really just talking about the position. But if you've already hired the public works director, it's a couple years down the road, they're doing a great job, you can use this exemption to go into closed session and talk about how well they're doing and kind of discuss whether or not their performance merits a raise. The next exemption allows closed session when considering financial, medical, social, or personal histories or disciplinary data of specific persons, or preliminarily considering specific personnel problems or investigating charges against specific people. But this exemption is only going to apply if the governmental body has actual knowledge that discussing those matters in public would be likely to have a substantial adverse effect on the reputation of a person referred to or involved. And with this, embarrassment is not enough, and neither is a preference for confidentiality. Next, you can go into closed session when deliberating or negotiating the purchase of public properties, investing of public funds, or conducting other specific public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require that closed session. So there's some nuance here with this exemption. The closed session has to be required to protect the competitive or bargaining stance. In other words, it's the only option. So let's say the village board is deliberating they want to buy a piece of property, and they want to deliberate on what's our total purchase price that we can pay, but hey, we want to try and save some money, so let's make an initial offer of maybe $100,000 less. Well, if they do all of that in open session and the property owner's there or gets wind of it, you can bet that they're going to pay that total authorized purchase price. That initial offer price is going out the window. And so that's a situation where you can make the argument that, hey, this closed session is needed to give us that bargaining edge, to give the municipality that bargaining edge. That's important there. It has to be the municipality's competitive or bargaining interest, not those of a third party. So, if it's a situation where the municipality is negotiating with a developer, their competitive stance does not factor in here. It's all about the municipality. Lastly, you can use closed session when you're conferring with your attorney, But this exemption is more narrow than people might think. Here, the attorney has to actually be rendering legal advice. So it's not just any time you're speaking with your attorney. And the advice has to be regarding litigation that the body is involved in or is likely to become involved in. The governmental body typically can decide who can attend a closed session meeting, but you do want to be careful here. There may be situations where whatever the topic is, it's appropriate to have a member of staff involved in that closed session because they, are bringing important information to the table. But there are going to be situations where it's not appropriate to include a third party in closed situation or in closed session. So let's say you are having a closed session using that competitive or bargaining exemption, and you're discussing negotiations that are ongoing between the municipality and a developer. If you invite the developer into that closed session to talk about the negotiations with the developer, and the argument is that the closed session is needed to protect your negotiating position, you've just undercut your argument that the exemption applies right there because the developer is included in that conversation. So it's clear that you didn't really need the closed session to protect your negotiating position if the developer's there. Appointed and elected body members also can't be excluded from a closed session of a body that they are a member of. If the governmental body is a subunit of a parent body, then the subunit must allow members of the parent body to attend open and closed session unless the parent body rules provide otherwise. So let's say the village board or common council creates a subcommittee. That subcommittee has to allow members of the board or council to attend its meetings and its closed sessions as well, unless the governing body's rules have allowed that subunit committee to exclude them. It's a little bit different when it's an independent statutory board or commission. So independent statutory boards and commissions like your library board or your plan commission or your police and fire commission, they're not considered subunits of the village board or the common council. And so in the league's opinion, we have said that these boards probably can exclude members of the village board or common council who are not also members of that independent statutory board or commission. Voting should always take place in open session unless the vote is integral to the reason for having the closed session. So in other words, voting should take place in open session unless it would undermine the reason for going into closed session to begin with. So going back to that example where the governing body wants to buy a piece of property, they go into closed session to set the total purchase price they can pay and then make an initial offer price determination. Well, if you have all that discussion in closed session, you reach your numbers, but then you come back out and you vote on those numbers and say what they are in open session, it kind of defeats the purpose of going into closed session in the first place. So this is an example of a situation where you probably can take that vote in closed session. But generally speaking, voting should be done in open session. Any member that participates in a closed session vote can require that the vote is taken in such a way that it records the member of each individual voting. Motions and roll call votes made in closed session must be recorded and preserved. They are also potentially subject to disclosure under the public records law. So any minutes that you take in closed session could be subject to disclosure. It's not automatic. You have to engage in that analysis like you always do when you get a public records request. The closed session exemptions are indicative of public policy that weighs in favor of non-disclosure, but they're not dispositive. You've got to conduct the analysis. And it might be that it shakes out that you have to release those records. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're in closed session. What do you really want to put in your minutes? You have to include any substantive information, but after that, there's some discretion as to the level of detail you get into. Typically, once the reason for going into closed session has expired, it's unlikely that there's going to be adequate justification based on the closed session being the setting that those records were created for withholding the record. You're probably going to have to disclose them. Violations of the law are enforced by the district attorney when a complaint is brought. If the attorney or the district attorney does not take action, the attorney general can. And then if neither decide to pursue the complaint, the individual who brought the complaint can bring an action on behalf of the state. Any member who knowingly attends a meeting in violation of the law can be subject to forfeitures between $25 and $300. And then lastly, in addition to the resources that the league has put out on this topic, I always want to point people to a great resource put out by the Department of Justice. It's their DOJ Open Meetings Law Compliance Guide. The link is on the slide. It's also really easy to find just by Googling. They have a public records one as well. And these guides were both just updated in 2024. So I highly recommend checking them out. The DOJ is the agency that is tasked with interpreting and enforcing the open meetings law and the public records law. And so this compliance guide provides a lot of insight into how you can make sure that you're in compliance with the law to the best of your abilities. And with that, we have a little bit of time for questions if there are any. All right, so can you give an example of a spontaneous closed session? Well, it could really be anything if it relates to a matter that was on the public notice and an exemption applies. So, trying to think of one off the cuff. It's hard to think of a specific example. I apologize. But let's say, you're having a discussion about something related to staff, and information comes to light that was included on the public notice, and information comes to light that you can use one of those personnel related statutory exemptions, and there's a need to go into closed session now. Then as long as the exemption applies, it relates back to a meeting that was on the public notice in the first place, you can go into a spontaneous closed session. I still think that if that conversation can wait until the next meeting and you can notice it in advance of the meeting, that's probably the best course of action. But if there's a need to have it right then and there and all the requirements are met, the law does allow for you to do it on the spot. Can a non-voting administrator member of the executive board ask for a roll call vote? So this question sounds like it's pretty specific to your municipality. That sounds like a locally created committee. And the statutes don't talk about committees. They talk about some boards and commissions, but when it comes to committees, they're really locally created. They're creatures of the municipality that created them. So the rules that relate to the committee are going to depend on what the municipality, how it has structured them. So I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think the open meetings law is really going to speak to who can ask for a vote. Now, if it's something where, you're in the closed session and it's a body that's subject to the closed session, or I'm sorry, it's a governmental body in closed session and it's a member of the governmental body, then I do think the law gives them the right to require that the vote is taken in a way that all voting members' votes are recorded and preserved. All right. Closed session needs to be a specific reason attached to the closed session statute. You can't put closed session on if necessary. Correct. I'm not sure I understand that question. It might be asking whether you can kind of like hedge your bets and say, we might have a closed session, we might not. We're just going to put it on just in case. I don't think you should do that. I don't think that's good practice because, it starts to lose its importance if it's just on there, but maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure if the DOJ has weighed in on that necessarily, or if a court has. I do know that, we've talked about this in the context of the bad key notices in the past, where, we get questions, well, can I just put a bad key notice on all of my public notices just in case a quorum shows up? And, our stance on that has been, well, no, because then you do that enough, you're not really providing the information to the public that you're supposed to be providing. Let's say, and hey, something different might happen at this meeting. Because if it's just always there, you start to tune it out. All right. I am not sure if there are others that are still outstanding based on this. Nick or Ryan, please feel free to chime in if there are some that haven't been addressed, and I'm happy to take them. Or if people have more questions now, please throw them in the Q&A.
Maria, while we're waiting for a few more questions, I just want to highlight that there is a FAQ page on the league's website on open meetings law. I did put that link in the chat. Those are there 24/7. A lot of great information in those FAQ pages, a lot of topics that we cover there. And again, these slides are on the Food for Thought page, and the recording will be up in a few days on if you go to that Food for Thought page, there's a link that will take you to the hidden recordings on our YouTube channel. And for the question in the chat on Robert's Rules, we actually just covered that in June, so you can go ahead and find that recording there as well. We'll go back to questions.
All right. Not hearing any questions. I'll take a look at the Q&A. If volunteer members of a commission sponsors or joins a public event, such as a talk by an author or similar, does their participation does it need to be noticed like a meeting? Well, the first question is it a governmental body? If it's a governmental body, then you need to determine whether or not the showers test is met. Is there a purpose to engage in government business? And are there enough people gathered? So if it's just one person, probably not going to be a problem from a numbers perspective. It's just not clear. I think I need a little bit more information to give you more concrete guidance. But definitely it's possible. It's just going to depend on the facts, whether or not that rises to the level of being required to notice it publicly.
All right. We're right at 1 o'clock. Um, And there is a Ask the Attorneys feature on our website. I did include the link in the chat, but you can go to our website anytime and shoot us a question. We'd love to answer your questions, help you out. That feature just allows us to do a little bit of research, maybe a little bit about your community or the particular statute you have a question on. And that is it for today. Maria Davis, thank you so much. We enjoyed putting you on the hot seat, and we'll have to put Ryan and Nick back on the hot seat soon. But thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thanks, everybody.